Diligence. We'll also be talking about an innovative human rights thermometer that's now available to companies to help enhance their human rights governance in their companies. I'm Angela Miller, and I head our ESG division at IDB Invest. I'm lucky to have with me here a great group of panelists. We have Juliana Lopez, Director of Nature and Society of CEBED's Brazilian Council for the Sustainable Development. Thanks, Juliana. And Rafael Benke, CEO and founder of Proactiva Results, with whom IDB Invest has recently partnered for a pilot project in human rights in Argentina and other initiatives. Thanks, Rafael. So I just wanted to start briefly talking a little bit about what we've discovered at IDB Invest in a recent policy update on sustainability, on our sustainability policy, where we underwent a extensive public consultation with civil society members. And the main issue of interest to society had to do with human rights and social issues. The other thing we've been seeing is that those are the issues that most affect the projects that we finance. So over 90% of the ESG issues that we see that companies are running into in Latin America have to do with social issues and human rights. Conversely, what we've seen is that companies who have really sound stakeholder engagement and work on human rights are those that are more sustainable in the future and over time. I know that the word human rights tends to be a little bit polarized in some countries in the region. It's something that we've seen. But we think it's important to try to unpack what's really behind the term human rights. We've also noticed that a lot of international investors are increasingly using the terminology of human rights and looking at all these social issues under a human rights lens. So with that, I wanted to kick off the first question to Rafael so he can explain to us a little bit more about what does human rights mean, what's a human rights due diligence, and why is it so important?
Amazing. Thank you for the invitation, Angela. Very good to be here with Juliana. I think you tackled on a very interesting point, which is the spectrum of human rights today, right? I think people at the center is what we're talking about. And when we're talking about human rights, we're not only talking about the more traditional issues of knowledge, such as workers' conditions, but also the environment, security, socioeconomic aspects. If we look at the Sustainable Development Goals, over 90%, or not 90% of those goals are directly linked to human rights. So when we are talking about the human rights due diligence, this is a process whereby we put people at the center, put human rights in this ample spectrum of topics at the center, and understand, identify if there are risks to these human rights, if there are impacts, and how we can prevent these risks, mitigate these impacts, and also on the positive side, what are the opportunities to promote and optimize positive impacts on human rights. So this process has a milestone in the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, as well as the OECD guidelines that bring a reference on how companies should do this type of procedures, incorporating that in their good governance, in their processes, so that they can undertake these processes and have a more sustainable approach towards people.
Super, thanks so much, Rafael. Now, Juliana, you represent CEBED, the voice of the business sector for sustainable development in Brazil. Why the idea of using a human rights thermometer? And why should companies think about joining this initiative? Can you highlight a few key aspects of why they should do that? Thanks.
Thank you so much, Angela and Rafael, for the invitation. For sure, it's a pleasure to share some insights based on this assessment we have done in partnership with Proactiva, running the HR Human Rights Thermometer. The first motivation was having a measurable way, a measurable approach to assess human rights practice with our companies. So we could assess the adherence to human rights principles. As Rafael explained, this is our guide, the Human Rights Principles for Companies. So with this clear framework, we could have this baseline in terms of assessment and guide our companies through a journey. So, and we have very good lessons learned from this assessment. So some insights, for example, with our from the total of our members, and we have 114 members of SEBEDIS, we had 42 companies who ran the assessment, which represents 63% of the total members of SEBEDIS. And this sample is very representative. So we had 12 economic sectors represented by this sample. So it was very good to understand these main drivers that are motivating our companies to embed human rights into business strategy. And one of the highlights is related to the risks management. So 96% of the respondent companies prioritize human rights risks and impacts based on severity. And they also have set 80%, a big majority, have set standards related to supply chains. So as code of conduct and also contract clauses. So these are some highlights, but of course there are some gaps that should be filled and that we are working to build capacity and engage our companies, such as, for example, in terms of plans of mitigation of remedy adverse impacts on human rights. Only 24% of companies have set plans of this kind. So we clearly see now with this baseline, we can now guide and inspire our companies to share practices and embed effectively this discussion into the business agenda and keep evolving on this with a very clear and pragmatic tool.
Super. Thank you, Juliana. Now, Rafael, can you share with us some data or some highlights that you've seen from countries outside of Brazil? And if you can also share with us what you think, in your perspective, are the key challenges in terms of incorporating human rights due diligence in the supply chains. Thanks.
I think starting with the last question, I believe the idea of using this thermometer is exactly the fact that through these frameworks we were talking about earlier, there are many references, very detailed references on how to improve corporate practice for a good due diligence, a good care of the human rights dimension. So if you take a tool like the thermometer, it generates over 400 data points for a company to assess how it could do better. And for a group of companies also to understand, like the SEBEDS, the board of SEBEDS, to understand how they can move forward in a better performance path. So it's very important for us to understand that these frameworks today are tackling aspects of how to do a risk assessment, how to evaluate these risks, how we should engage with the parties, what is a meaningful consultation, how should I structure my policies, how should I structure my grievance mechanisms. So these are aspects that we are, during the Sustainability Week, discussing so many of the panels, and that the business and human rights due diligence brings a very good reference. So with that, in various initiatives we've run today, almost 500 companies have used this thermometer. We see that there are groups of companies and sectors that will be more advanced in some of these aspects, particularly regarding their own operations. The challenge starts when it goes to suppliers and supply chain, the direct suppliers, the indirect suppliers. The farther you go from your operations, the less of an understanding you have about your risks. The other challenge is when you think of value chain, how do you approach your product, right? And how your product may also bring risks to people. So it is interesting when we take the Argentina example where we ran this pilot project with IDB Invest's support. The group of companies that worked with SEADs, around 60% of them had structured process of risk and assessment for human rights, which is very high. 60% having structured projects. But when we go into the detail, we can see that 100% of these companies, they are looking at their own operations. When you go to suppliers, it goes down to 70%. And when you go to the product detail, it will go down to 50%. So less and less structure when it goes farther. So these are very clear and measurable and tangible aspects that we can see. And then in the details of over 400 data points to give the path to the companies on how to improve this performance.
Thank you so much, Rafael. I think, yeah, definitely it's very important. That's the idea of the thermometer giving us information on the baseline so that we can give a sense to companies how they can move forward. And on the topic of moving forward, Juliana, I wanted to ask you, how do you think companies can act collectively to advance their work on human rights due diligence, and how can CEBEDS help these companies with that journey?
Brilliant. Yes, there is this is a very effective way to take this collective approach, because we can accelerate action taking by sharing practices and inspire companies to move forward further than they would achieve by themselves working alone. And so we have now a clear path to move forward with this baseline of the thermometer. And we now understand that there is a journey, and step by step we hope to guide and build capacity from our companies, and also take this strategic level, take this discussion to a more strategic level, for example, to bring this to the boardrooms table, engaging C-level professionals. This is a clear challenge. And also, we see an opportunity in terms of these risks and opportunities perception from our companies. We perceive a clear trend of transition from volunteer practice to mandatory practice, with some regulation signals coming from, for example, UGR and European Union, and this also is perceived here in Brazil particularly as a risk, but also an opportunity to, for example, take this positive approach in terms of searching for having a positive effect in your operations from the lens on human rights and, of course, from social and environment. And also we have now some clear asks, clear business asks, and of course, as a consequence, policy asks. So we have been working on building recommendations to Brazilian government on setting a regulation system in Brazil with regards to human rights and business. So we have assessed and published a technical note on a bill proposed on this regard. So now we have more elements and inputs to strengthen this work on advocacy too, and taking this collective approach.
Thanks so much, Juliana. Lastly, Rafael, the concept of the supply chain is over the years has grown in importance, and the focus on the need to look at human rights due diligence in the supply chain has been a focus of conversation, especially over the last few years. Could you tell us a little bit about how you would advise a company to select the group of the supply chain that they should be applying this human rights due diligence to, and talk a little bit about your perspective on the supply chains?
Yeah, no, fantastic. I think supply chain is really the big challenge. We see the recently approved EU directive, the so-called CSDDD, rendering that mandatory to all EU states to look at human rights due diligence in supply chains across the world. This will have a domino effect in the world, including our region here in the Americas. So I think this connects directly to what Juliana was saying. How do we embark our supply chains in this due care to people, in the due diligence to human rights? And I believe the Human Rights Thermometer as a tool in that context is to bring them really to the understanding of how to implement that as part of their corporate culture and corporate practice. So I think, of course, the command and control by companies and the specific dispositions in contracts are very important, and have this verification of your clients is very important. But how do you really bring them on board of the due diligence? So we are seeing some companies applying the thermometer in their supply chains in critical suppliers, so that they can understand themselves where are their gaps, and they can embark in this journey that Juliana was talking about. So of course the methodology to do this and seek the criticality has international references, and once you do that, you can embark these suppliers into this better understanding for better practices.
Super. Thanks so much, Rafael and Juliana. And with that, just want to thank everyone. If you want more information on the Human Rights Thermometer or any more guidance, please reach out to us on LinkedIn. Thanks so much.